The conference was simply not about transformation, which is, I think, what many of us wanted, and many of us who participated, for example, in the science article from the Earth System Governance. It wasn't about that because neither the United Nations General Assembly nor the conference secretariat presented a transformative vision. Instead, it saw the conference, and these are not my words, these are words I heard coming out of people in the secretariat, was about integration, implementation, and coherence. The strongest state supporters, China, Brazil, South Africa, shared this view. So these are terms of consolidation, not transformation, and that was reflected in the process and outcome. The second argument I want to make is that the one potentially transformative idea, which is the green economy, one of the main two conference themes, could not succeed when the underlying normative compromises that held together Rio 1 were off limits. So my take on norms is maybe just a slight nuance on perhaps what Oren and Peter were saying. So the problem is that the green economy was precisely about reformulation of some of those norms. And on a sort of really basic level, potentially they challenge common but differentiated responsibility on the one hand, while limits to the compatibility of free trade and markets with environmental goals, Principle 12, was also on the table. So since it might mean relaxing rules on intellectual property, treating green products and services as special categories, admitting there were short-term trade-offs to achieve environmental goals, or even if green economy could be seen, as Oren was saying, as a more radical move to a more radical kind of transformative idea of the relationship between the economy and the environment around the planet, there was no, people were, the parties, the negotiators were unwilling to move away from the norms that they were locked into before. So while not a complete repudiation, the tepid reception of green economy, the adamant linkage to the context of poverty eradication instead of considering it as an economy-wide concept, and the rejection of the idea of a roadmap of indicators indicated continued suspicion of the concept, even as the elements, certain elements of the agenda, such as focus on green employment and technology and so on, may veer ahead. The other key conditions actually are interesting that were attached to the concept. This is ideas, and we heard Lawrence Tudiana talk about this yesterday, in terms of ownership, sovereignty, and so on. These actually can be important conditions for successfully benefiting from international initiatives and contributing to sustainable development domestically. So I don't actually think that's a negative, and the evaluation report of delivery as one kind of reaffirms that. However, what is concerning is that the green economy generated fears of a one-size-fits-all agenda, which prevented its uptake as a driver of, quote, the future we want. So what we're left with in the green economy is sort of a possible toolkit for which we pick and choose, lest it be, in the minds, I think, of many developing countries, the future they impose. The third argument I want to make is that equally significant for what its failure as a transformative idea, or the failure of thinking about Rio as transformative, when we combine it with the weakness of the overall outcome, what it signals for multilateralism. It revealed that new articulations of political compromise or accommodation of rising economy has either failed to emerge, or simply we have not caught up with the structural changes in power in the system combined with entrenched or very slowly changing identities. So while some may read the Brazilian maneuver as saving multilateralism, and I'm not sure if that's a view held by others, but it was in some reports afterwards that the Brazilians actually saved multilateralism because, saved multilateralism because they got this outcome. I read it as signaling the complete inability of a comprehensive multilateral process to produce commitments that require any serious trade-offs or compromises. So let's recall what the Brazilians did. They took a clearly unmanageable and bloated outcome document, over 2/3 of which was still in brackets. They took it out of the hands of the negotiators, trimmed it only slightly, gave back 283 paragraphs of consensus language devoid of commitments, punted final decisions to the General Assembly and other follow-up processes, and then presented it as a take-it-or-leave-it document. So whatever the reasons Brazil intervened in the way it did, and we've heard some explanations, it was symptomatic of what we see in a growing number of multilateral forums that require compromises to build coherence and momentum on global concerns like sustainable development, climate change, or global trade. So the environment's not alone here. Just look at the WTO, where the idea of a single undertaking is crucial, has been crucial in the past, to linkages and trade-offs that are so important for developing countries. The hope of achieving that in the current round of WTO negotiations is all but dead. Instead, we see in the WTO negotiations being broken down into pieces. The likely result will be plurilateral agreements that don't resolve fundamental conflicts between developing and developed countries, and bilateral agreements proliferate to fill a vacuum, often with uneven bargaining power. So we only get single undertakings now in forums like Rio, where hard decisions, trade-offs, or commitments are not necessary. Brazil, the Brazilians' move, I think, throws in the towel on large-stage multilateralism. It's not, it's rescue. Okay, on the more optimistic side. Like others, I'm actually a little more optimistic on what happened with the institutional framework for sustainable development, the second major theme. I think that it surpassed expectations. If one acknowledges there was never anywhere close to the required political coalition to upgrade UNEP, actually what was achieved, I think, was fairly remarkable. And the question is whether it creates an enabling institutional environment for a transformative moment. And here I'd actually like to discuss with Oren if they have to be in the order that Oren was laying out. So let me, I'll get to just a slightly different formulation. But let's just see what was accomplished. So first, UNEP on a functional level basically got everything identified in the Nairobi-Helsinki process. I completely agree with Maria. They really got everything, they should be thrilled. They got everything that they wanted, except for the change in name and status, which I don't think means very much. Though the question of whether that actually translates into new resources, or Maria thinks it will, or ability to influence the broader sustainable agenda is a more open question. Second, the sustainable development goals we've heard a lot about. This was the one concrete outcome. I would argue the idea gained traction in part because it delivered a commitment on some political action in a document where that was otherwise absent. And it was clear that the Secretary saw it that way, the state saw it that way, that there needed to be an outcome, and maybe this is the momentum point Frank was making earlier. There's got to be something, concrete that comes out of these processes. The surprising agreement, I think, is to create a high-level political forum, especially if its articulated functions that are laid out are actually incorporated, which include legal response to emerging issues, monitoring and review. It can play a major role in political orchestration, depending on whether it can link to the international financial institutions and the broader polycentric system, which is the reality of global governance today. If it's linked with the sustainable development goals in the future, I think there's some optimism, some potential, but of course it's a big open question. The last thing that I think is accomplished when people have paid attention to is a strong endorsement for Real Principle 10 on access to information, participation, and justice, and so on. We're actually seeing in Latin America some concrete treaty activity around this. So there have been some good outcomes. The question is, and this comes back to Oren's point, can these modest organizational and institutional initiatives provide an enabling environment for political leadership to better integrate sustainable development, not only throughout the UN, but in the promised new links and initiatives in the IFIs and polycentric governance. So I don't think the conditions are right for the normative transformation that I agree would be better if it came first. So the question is, can these more modest organizational and potentially institutional changes create an environment in which we can have a recursive leading to the place where Oren would like us to go? Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. You really managed to bring up some new points. I'm sure this group now could discuss among themselves for the remainder half hour. They're not allowed to do that, at least not initially. So the floor is open, and please identify yourself. Yes, okay.
Susana Vieira from Brazil. I teach at university. I would like to say a few things about that. I was in Rio, as Peter will remember, and I was there as a delegate for the International Law Association, in which last two committees on sustainable development I have been very